Hello AP US History students with National University Virtual High School and National University Academy. This is Mr. Goyette. We're going to review Unit 7 content to prepare you for your quizzes, your discussions, and our in-class activities. Those of you taking the online class will be taking your finals this week and your last few quizzes. So good luck with finishing up the course, and thank you for sticking with us throughout the year. Let's go over post-World War II domestic and foreign policy. I've already covered some of it in the last chapter and in units 5 and 6, but now we're getting closer to the Vietnam War. So after World War II, with the growth of the suburbs, the residential areas around Chicago and New York doubled. And you'll remember in your textbook at the beginning of the chapter for, I think it's chapter 30, they talk about Levittown, Long Island, and that's on page 839. An accurate description of the social makeup of the suburbs at that time. You can review that on page 842. There are a lot of stereotypes about the suburbs as being whitewashed, and in Levittown's case, that was very accurate because you couldn't buy a house there if you were a minority. If you were African American, Hispanic, you had to be a white person to live in Levittown. So there was a racism in Long Island. However, in the majority of the suburbs, there was a surprising variety of particularly all economic types, excluding mainly the very rich and the very poor. The suburbs were more diverse than the stereotypes portray, and you can review this census information on page 842. The United States achieved an affluence in the 1950s that made the persistent fear of another Great Depression seem very irrational. And remember, with the baby boom, the growth of suburbia, and the auto industry thriving, there was a lot of me going on, and a lot of purchasing and consumer power. So if you review this information on page 841 in your textbook, you'll see that the Cold War fears might have been there, but the idea of a Great Depression or another recession was not looming for Americans. The Soviet launch of Sputnik revealed in America a haunting insecurity and growing apprehension about the priorities of our competitive edge. The idea was that the Soviets were gaining ground militarily and in the space race with the launch of Sputnik, and it made many Americans and American politicians very anxious about America's position on the world stage. The attitude of most Americans towards further political and social influence or reforms after World War II, especially domestically, because the newly acquired affluence turned them away from these reforms. Basically, things were going well, so any mention of, but this minority class isn't doing well, or women aren't faring well. The United States was very positive at the time, so any reforms as far as civil rights during the Truman administration and Eisenhower administration were not being pushed forward. You can review this information on page 848 under the Jackson Pollock painting. Let's see. President Truman's legislative programs, the Fair Deal, called for dismantling. Actually called for national medical insurance, federal aid to education, civil rights advances, and the desegregation of the armed forces. While these were civil rights and medical insurance issues were on the top of the list for the Fair Deal, many Americans did not express those as their primary concerns, but the Fair Deal did try to push forward reforms. You can review this again on page 848. Brown versus Board of Education, and the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka determined that separate educational facilities for races had to be eliminated. Review that on page 852. So now this initial blasé attitude towards reform among most of the population is starting to butt heads with a lot of the local leaders and a lot of the legislators who are starting to push for reforms as we get closer into the mid-1950s and 1960s. Eisenhower's decision to send troops into Little Rock, Arkansas was in response to local authorities' refusal to integrate Central High. And you'll read up on Fabus and segregation now, segregation forever, his speeches, and this clash of the movement to hold on to a segregated South and the federal efforts to change the South and make it more tolerant of integration. Definitely review the work, the efforts of Martin Luther King, Frederick Leonard, Medgar Evers. On page 853, you can view more of that. And if you have the time, please watch the series Eyes on the Prize. It's an excellent series. If you can ever get a hold of that, sit down and watch it through and through. Pay attention to what happens to Jim's work. Very interesting confrontation there during the bus boycotts and the freedom rides. The main purpose of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, was to direct a movement against segregation and promote peaceful confrontation against the enemies of racial equality. You'll remember that the works of Henry David Thoreau were highly influential to the movement and to Martin Luther King. He talked about civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience, basically not going along with the policies of your government in a peaceful manner so as to force change. These techniques were successfully used by Mahatma or Mohandas Gandhi in India in confronting British colonialism and imperialism in India. Gandhi's efforts are going to, including the Salt March, are going to force the British out of India eventually. You can review the information about the SCLC, though, on page 354. The Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, or SNCC, was responsible for direct but peaceful confrontation that would heighten the social tension of the civil rights movement. This is the bottom of page 855. They were, again, trying to, by going into the bus depots and going to lunch counters and eating where they were not supposed to be eating, going into facilities that were segregated, they were forcing the authorities to arrest them, and then they would point out the fact that these were ridiculous laws of segregation. Women discovered that suburban life in post-war America encouraged them to devote their efforts toward homemaking. There wasn't a push towards feminism as of yet, although rates of women in the workplace doubled at this time. Women were encouraged to stay home, and homemaking was celebrated in magazines like McClure's and others. Review that on page 843. The main voting bloc that contributed to the election of Truman in 1848 consisted of farmers, organized labor, African Americans, and other minorities. This is on page 848. I'll have time for one more, and then I'll pause here before I finish up this review. Critics of the consumer society in the 1950s in literature were known as the Beats. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs were all writing these counterculture novels about the United States, and some in the traditions of Walt Whitman celebrating the United States, but still being somewhat critical of the suburban lifestyle. The Beats would travel, sometimes living off the pocket change and donations of others, and so this was seen as being a deadbeat or a beatnik. Quite clearly they were in some cases, but Kerouac was a successful author who was read widely at the time and is still read today. I'm going to pause here now, and I'm going to let you take notes on this, go back and review your textbooks, get your textbooks out. I'll start the second section here in a moment. Good luck on your exams. I'll be right back.